Hey guys, welcome back to the latest Sidcast. This one picking up where we left off after the Reign of Terror with the Napoleonic era, which began roughly around 1799, I guess 1800 to 1815. So in review, just want to make sure that we're okay with the background of Napoleon. We know that he was Corsican, not even French, but he rose to prominence under the Directory and became a national hero for defending the government and his military conquests into Italy and Egypt, many times at the expense of Great Britain. Abbé Sieyès was the leader of a conspiracy against the Directory, and he invited Napoleon to sneak into France and join conspirators to overthrow the Directory. So this was officially in 1799, November of 1799, which it is known as the coup d'etat. He drove legislators from the Legislative Assembly, and a new constitution began the era that we know of as the Consulate, which included 3 consuls. What's interesting about this is Napoleon knew how popular he was, so he initiated this with a nationwide plebiscite to vote to name himself the head of the government. And he did. He became the first consul, and he was granted supreme power, almost absolute power, more of an enlightened despot type like Voltaire wanted. And the amazing thing about this was that it was approved 3 million votes to roughly 1,500 opposed. So we're going to break down this fascinating era of Napoleon by hopefully getting you to understand that there were 3 very important roles that Napoleon is remembered as. First, Napoleon the Conqueror, then Napoleon as a reformer, and then, of course, Napoleon as a dictator. So let's talk first about Napoleon the Conqueror. For all his failings as a ruler, Napoleon was early on nearly an unbeatable general. He was unbelievable. He had the respect and unquestioned loyalty of his army, and his army at this point was extremely experienced and efficient. All the officers in his army rose by merit, not just because of their privileged class. So one of the things that this helped was he became able to have the most efficient European army at this particular time. Again, because people were rising to their positions based on how good they were, not because of who their dad was or what their name was. And then, again, it enables him to carry out bold battlefield tactics that a lot of the nobility wouldn't even contemplate doing because they thought it was absurd. But he was able to do it because, A, he was bold and he was an awesome general, but also because the people that rose under prominence and he trained were also as good a generals as he was. And we'll show a map later, but one by one, Napoleon took out the Italian provinces, Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire and Prussia, and scared Russia to exit the fight. The coalition broke down. He was just crushing them, annihilating them. So this kind of gives you an idea of how vast Napoleon's conquests are in blue. I mean, we're talking Charlemagne-ish. We're talking old-time, Roman status. So by 1805, Napoleon and France had conquered or made allies out of pretty much all of Europe, marking the first time anyone had ever controlled Europe like this. It was the largest empire, as I just stated, since Roman times. And obviously it didn't last. In the conquered areas, he created dependent satellite kingdoms where he appointed his own people, which is usually nepotism. Nepotism is, appointing your family members to help you run. And in this case, he appointed his family members to run the thrones of his conquered domains. So his brother Louis was the king of Holland for 6 years. His brother Joseph was the king of Spain in 1808. And his sister Caroline was queen of Naples. And his stepson was the ruler of Lombardy, Venice, and the Papal States. As great of a conqueror as he was on the continent, Britain proved to be a thorn in his side. He was unable to invade Britain. So in order to kind of counter this, Napoleon banned all European trade with Britain. This is known as the continental system. You must know this. And you need to know at the same time, Britain did what they always do, is they used their navy to blockade. So they blockaded all of France. So this continental system and this whole battle with Britain was issued after his loss at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So he mandated an alliance with his conquered domains. He did this with his Berlin Decree, where he sought to starve Britain out by closing all the ports on the continent to British trade. He coerced Russia, Prussia, Denmark, Portugal, and Spain to participate in this boycott. It's interesting because Britain responds with something called the Orders in Council, in which all neutral ships can only enter Europe if they stop in Great Britain first and load up with British goods before returning to Europe, which made this, kind of illegal in terms of the continental system. But basically, they tried to strangle French trade, not French imports of British goods. So we have smuggling going on here. So Napoleon responds in 1807 with the Milan Decree. Any neutral ship entering a British port or submitting to a British warship at sea would be confiscated by the French if it came to Europe. And this is just a back and forth, and really Napoleon's going to have a tough time enforcing this because it's Britain that rules the high seas. Coincidentally, if you're a student of U.S. history, we got caught in the middle of this. We wanted to be neutral. However, we get caught like a punching bag between what Britain wants and what France wants. And this leads us to get involved with the War of 1812. Coincidentally, with U.S. history, too, we have a huge event in our young nation, thanks to Napoleon, who wants to raise money for his conquests in Europe. And that is of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, in which Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. The continental system fails. Britain had cheap stuff. The French Navy was a joke compared to the British. And, let's face it, Britain had cheap quality stuff. We haven't learned this yet, but the Industrial Revolution pretty much starts in Britain. So they were kind of like China of the day. They had quality, cheap manufactured goods that the rest of Europe wanted. And so, again, they'll find a way to get this stuff, whether it's breaking the continental system or smuggling, which is breaking the continental system. And this is basically what we have. So Britain made up for their down trade by trading also with Latin American nations who revolted. And then again, if you want me to tell you this, this is where we issued the Monroe Doctrine in terms of our opposition to and worry of England dominating the Western Hemisphere. So the next role that we try to analyze Napoleon as is a reformer. And so when Napoleon was in charge, he wanted to seem like he was continuing the themes of the Revolution, when in reality, only a few aspects would remain the same. He wanted to be like the late Roman or Byzantine emperors. And so therefore he enacted the Concordat of 1801, which made the Catholic Church the favored religion and provided some state funding, much like Charlemagne did by accepting the title of Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas way back when. So making peace with the church was really a strategic task that he carried out. Making peace with the church would help weaken its link with the monarchy or the monarchists who sought to restore the Bourbons. Religion would also help people accept some of the economic inequalities in French society. And we know that Karl Marx says that religion is the opiate of the people. It pacifies them. So some of the provisions of this Concordat in 1801, which he used to help crown himself Holy Roman Emperor, included papacy renounced its claims to the church property that had been confiscated during the Revolution. Remember, the Revolution confiscated church property with the civil constitution of the clergy. The French government also was allowed to nominate or depose bishops, kind of a continuation of the Concordat of Bologna. Priests who had resisted the civil constitution of the clergy would replace those who had sworn an oath to the state and were elected. So that made the Catholic Church and the Pope happy. And since the Pope gave up his claim to church lands, those who acquired the land pledged loyalty to Napoleon's government because they would benefit from it. Catholics were allowed to worship in public, which had been banned under Robespierre in the Reign of Terror. And the Catholic Church was allowed to reopen seminaries that had been closed during the Revolution. They extended legal toleration to Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and atheists, who basically under the Napoleonic Code will all come to have the same civil rights. and they replaced the revolutionary crazy calendar with the old Christian calendar. So it's kind of a return to normalcy, if you will, for a lot of French. The Concordat, this is a synthesis point, is much like, as we mentioned, what the Holy Roman Emperor did or Charlemagne did back in the day, but it's also something that Mussolini will do in the 20th century, known as the Lateran Accord. So stay tuned for that in historical period 4. Napoleon also, as a reformer, started the first state education system and designed it to educate a large range of French citizens. It was a system of public education under state control. There were rigorous standards, but it was open to the masses. Secondary and higher education was reorganized to prepare young men for government service and professional occupations. Now, education under Napoleon became important in determining social standing. There was kind of a two-tier system. There was one system for those who could spend 12 or more years at school. And then again, like for trades, there was another system for boys who entered the workforce eventually at age 12 or 14. So again, you still had a kind of a diversified or stratified system for education. Napoleon was a big fan of equality and basically earning what you have. So he created a new civil code for France. And again, this basically provides unity, the first clear, complete codification of French law, common law for the entire nation. And it's known as the Napoleonic Code. In the Napoleonic Code was a civil code, which was a code of criminal procedure, and a commercial code and a penal code. It emphasized the protection of private property. It made equality before the law based off of nothing other than equality. There was no more estates, no more second-tier legal classes that had certain privileges. All local liberties and hereditary offices were gone. He abolished serfdom and actually gave women some inheritance rights. The next thing in regards to reform, he created a system where careers were open to talent. We talked about this as to what made the Napoleon army great and the French army great. He also opened this as a reform to all of France. People could rise in government service based on their abilities and their performance. So a new imperial nobility was created to reward the most talented generals and government officials. It's kind of like the table of ranks that Peter the Great initiated. However, that one was based off of how loyal you were. So this is a little bit different, but kind of similar in its goal to create a new group of government officials that are loyal to you. But in this case, it's also based off of not just your loyalty, but also your performance. So while Napoleon is known as a dictator as well as a reformer and a conqueror. So, it was true, Napoleon favored equality before the law, but he was not equal with his law. And there were severe inequalities for the status of women. He denied women the equal status except for inheritance rights, and women had no legal property or divorce rights. And husbands could actually imprison their wives for adultery. Women could not buy or sell property or begin a business without the consent of their husbands. Let's face it, Napoleon had a police state. He had a vast spy system that kept citizens under constant surveillance. After 1810, political suspects were held in state prisons as they had been during the Reign of Terror. So Napoleon had around 2,500 political prisoners in 1814. Now, he didn't behead them, and he was ruthless in putting down his opposition, especially the guerrillas in the western provinces like the Vendée and Brittany. Another example of him being more of a dictator is that in 1804 he arrested and executed a Bourbon duke who had supposedly taken part in a plot against Napoleon. However, there were no evidence at the time that this gentleman was involved. And really, European public opinion was livid about this execution. He also invoked censorship, limiting what could or couldn't be said about him. And while he didn't execute a huge amount of political enemies, he made sure to quickly exile or deport anyone who was against him or his policies with his secret police force. And lastly, he reintroduced slavery into the Caribbean. So that wasn't really enlightened. So in the end, there were mixed legacy and results, much like the enlightened despots that we learned earlier. There were other drawbacks. Workers were not allowed to form unions. There were repressed liberties. He subverted republicanism and restored absolutism in France through his police state. He also practiced nepotism by placing relatives on the thrones of conquered nations.